Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. Today we're going to be looking at the top 10 decks in the Surging Sparks format. We have had 5 IRL tournaments across the globe with this set already out, but we still have 3 more tournaments going on, including both Rio and the Birmingham Regional Championships happening this weekend, before we move on into the Prismatic Evolutions expansion. The ranking of our top 10 are going to be based on those limitless points earned for all of these archetypes. These are the best performers in the IRL, but also in the top of the screen you can see the PTCG Live popularity over the last month, as well as their online ranking in terms of top 8 placements. So by far and away, the best performing deck in the Surging Sparks metagame is Regidrago VSTAR, the archetype that looks to copy a bunch of dragon attackers from your discard pile, giving it a versatile toolbox of attacks to choose from, and has that fantastic Legacy Star which allows us to recover cards from our discard pile in order to assemble our combinations or reuse important cards in certain matchups. The matchup data doesn't look too appealing for Regidrago despite being by far and away the best deck, and that's because the metagame is completely warping around this archetype, with Regidrago oftentimes being the most popular deck in the room, or at least the one most worth teching against, because frequently we see the top tables, certainly in day 2s of the metagame, being flooded with this archetype. As for the boasts of Regidrago, it's still pretty solid into the Charizard matchup, and happy to see the Lost Zone box. It has a pretty close matchup into Gardevoir, it has slight unfavourables into Gholdengo, Lugia, as well as Roaring Moon, and for those very unfavourables, those matchups that are 40% or lower from the online data, there's Archaludon, which kind of falls between the cracks of Regidrago's typical damage output and incorporates lots of healing cards. There's the Terapagos archetype that can race quite effectively, as can the Raging Bolt EX, and finally we still struggle into the Snorlax Walling matchup. As for an example decklist, we're taking Cal Connor's Toronto first place list. I think this is a really solid baseline for anyone trying to take on the archetype. You have that phenomenal pentagram of dragon attackers that you can copy, giving you great options to reduce damage coming into you, spread damage when required, and still has that high damage output from Giratina when needed. And let's not forget that we can flip some coins with a Lone Exeggutor when we're coming up against some of these annoying basic attacking lists. There really isn't that much space left with Regidrago, it's been ironed out so much for months now, but it does seem like the potential wiggle room in the decklist is superior energy retrieval and possibly playing around with the stadium cards if you don't think they're the right tech inclusions for the upcoming tournament. As for other cards that could definitely be considered in the decklist, Hawlucha has that flying entry option, which can have great synergy alongside your Dragapult attack, as well as possibly Kyurem as well. Iron Bundle can be a great mirror match card where you're pushing away your opponent's Goodra attack, and could be combined with a Gusting effect to bring back a Regidrago for a one-hit KO that your opponent's not expecting, whilst at the same time again has great synergy with the wide variety of attacks we have available. And we have seen a 1-1 package of Noctowl come into the decklist, which gives you that little bit of search in the deck that is typically just dumping and drawing through the game. As for those other little engine tweaks, Terra Orb is a pretty cool card, especially with so many decklists going down to just one Dragapult and it still being such an important card to find. You effectively keep the same amount of outs, but you can also find both Teal Mask Ogerpon for a good early game search card, as well as the Alolan Exeggutor EX if that's the preferred option. And then finally, if you don't find any of those stadiums useful, you could always consider Pokestop. Giving you extra discard synergy is never a bad thing, and it does give us that little bit of extra reach in the decklist to try and work towards those crucial item cards like Earthen Vessel, like Energy Switch, and just getting into our ball search in general. Moving on to the second best performer in IRL events, we have Charizard. It's also the most popular and best performing deck in terms of top 8 placement in the last month of online tournaments. Charizard boasts a good time into Archaludon, which has been quite popular in the online scene, and remains very strong into the racing 2-prize archetypes, because Charizard is very solid at representing early game single prize boards, but also late game single prize boards with that Radiant Charizard that can bring the prize race back in your favour. Gardevoir, Lost Zone Box and Gholdengo all seem to be even matchups, with a slight concern going into Lugia, Regidrago, the new Terapagos because they often have type coverage via Hisuian Electrode, and the Dragapult Iron Thorns archetype, with Charizard's worst matchup being Snorlax. As for a starting point deck, we're going to look at Arnie's Stuttgart first place list. This is a really bread and butter simplistic 60. I really like the choice here to just simply maximise your ball search outs with the 4 Nest Ball, which you don't often see in Charizard. But Arnie's piloted this archetype for a decent amount of time, so I really respect this judgment. As for other options coming into the deck list, Manaphy does give you some bench protection where otherwise we can feel a little bit vulnerable into the Regidrago archetype, which, yes, can still clone around Manaphy, but does force a much more substantial combination compared to the opponent simply having to discard a Kyurem. A cancelling clone on our own end could be really useful to get through annoying walling Pokemon, but can also remove the effect of Iron Thorns in order to get our Charizard's ability in those matchups. Lost Vacuum could also be weaved into the deck list. I think if you're expecting a lot of Gardevoir, this is a reasonable choice, but can once again be a great way to remove some hit point buffing tools. In at number 3, we have the Snorlax blocking archetype. It's only the 14th most popular deck online, and is only the 12th best performing, which really does show that this isn't the most fun to play archetype, but is still very effective in IRL tournaments. In fact, Snorlax is consistently one of the archetypes that isn't in the day 1 field of play rate, but will often outperform the majority of other archetypes in the game in terms of day 1 to day 2 conversion. And it's pretty obvious to see why. Snorlax boasts a ton of favourable matchups. Charizard, Gardevoir, Gholdengo, Lost Box, Raging Bolt, and Regidrago are all in the 60+% category, with your main headaches coming in the form of Archaludon, Lugia, as well as Turbo Roaring Moon. We're looking at Dennis's 25th place regional list from Toronto. I know a handful of pilots all chose to play the exact same 60, with a number of other day 2 placements, Dennis simply being the highest finisher. And this is actually a big twist on what we've seen from Snorlax for a number of months, where the main draw engine of Rotom V has been completely scrapped in favour of having the boxed order item cards, in addition to changing the ace spec from the very frequent Hero's Cape to an enriching energy. This colourless energy, when you attach it for the turn, allows you to draw 4 cards, and you can find lots of ways to actually recycle this option. Usually this is going to be done before a penny, and actually improves what is already one of your best go-to supporter cards throughout the game. But you can also use this alongside Pidgeot V, vanishing the enriching energy back into the deck when need be, and eventually you can draw back into it and get reuse. This does allow Snorlax, when it cycles its own deck to that low portion, to use Palpad and gain instant access back to certain supporters as well, which can be critical in the late game. The other main tweak that we've seen with the Snorlax list is incorporating 2 copies of Klefki, and that's because Petra EX can be a big problem for Snorlax in general, getting around that block effect, and the Terapagos Cloth archetype chooses to use this in the list. You can now use Klefki to Mischievous Lock out that ability completely, essentially turning Klefki into a Snorlax in that specific matchup. And let's face it, in a ton of other situations, the Mischievous Lock is going to be a great way to slow the opponent down. When we're not relying on Rotom V ourselves, we can cash in on this really frustrating ability, giving us a little bit more time to get set up in games. If you don't trust the enriching energy, you can go back to a Hero's Cape plus Rotom V option. Still a very solid one. It takes a little bit less forward thinking than the boxed order, so could be the sort of easier approach to take on. If you feel like Snorlax is a good play for the tournament and are less experienced with it, this is definitely the easier build to go for. You can also consider the other walling Pokemon like Cornerstone Ogapon, and possibly Mantine in the deck list with that Born Ashore attack, forcing more Pokemon onto the opponent's bench. Where usually we just have the Flutes and the Erica's Invitation, now we can punish our opponent for pretty much playing well by discarding their liabilities. Now you can bring them back into play and create win conditions for yourself. If you are cutting that enriching energy, it's very often that Mist Energy will come into the deck list. In fact, even if you are playing enriching, Mist Energy is still a reasonable option. It can just make your walling Pokemon that much more frustrating, helping you now get around damage counter placement and the copying of like a Mew, for example. And Bravery Charm is a tool that I was really surprised not to see in the 60, actually. This has been a really commonplace card in many Snorlax builds. Regardless of your race spec, I do think Bravery Charm is still a really strong option in the list. In at number 4, we have Raging Bolt EX. This is the 7th most popular online and the 8th best performing, so it has been dipping a little bit in its popularity. There were times in the format where this was sort of in the top 3 of popularity. It definitely seems to be dipping. You can kind of see why. It does have a number of unfavourable matchups and a couple of high-profile, very unfavourables, that being Snorlax and Gardevoir. The main thing sort of propping up Raging Bolt is that you are still solid into a couple of those V-Star matchups, the Regidrago and the Lugia to an extent, and you also benefit from anyone jumping towards that Dragapult Iron Thorns archetype. Other than these boasts, there is a lot of outplay potential for opponents because you set your stall out with a number of 2 prizes, but Raging Bolt is still one of the highest consistency decks in the game. With that ridiculous damage cap and potential to gust on every turn of the game, it still will keep your opponent honest. We're going to take a look at Vincent Owen's 3rd place list from Toronto. Quite an unorthodox list, actually, because it's choosing to play Briar, which we haven't seen for a decent amount of time, as well as Lost Vacuum. I think the combination of these cards give this build of Raging Bolt a pretty solid time into Gardevoir, whereas as we saw, that's usually one of your awkward matchups, so potentially repairing that matchup makes the Raging Bolt much more appealing for you. Typically in Briar's place, you'll see something like Boss's Orders come into the 60 to try and chip in alongside your Catcher Flips and the Prime Catcher Ace spec. Because simplicity is the key for Raging Bolt, if you're missing turns, you're really a weak deck, I think it's still really important to have those high poker gear, high tracking shoe counts in the 60, so I wouldn't be muddling too much with it. It's really that debate if you think Briar is better than Boss's Orders or vice versa. And I did just want to give a quick nod to Ancient Boosted Energy Capsule if you wanted to tech against the Terapagos Clorf archetype, because you can sit at 300 hit points and you won't be affected by status conditions, which does allow you to sit out of range from all of their attackers from getting a one-hit KO against you, forcing them sometimes into a slightly more awkward position where they have to gust around you. Or, at the same time, you could have a Slitherwing in the active taking a KO and have an Ancient Boosted Raging Bolt on the bench, denying them from an easy Iron Bundle option. If you're very worried about Clorf Terapagos, you can include this, but I still think the Bravery Charm overall has more applications. In at number 5, we have Gardevoir. This is actually going up in popularity. It's back up to the top 3 in the online spaces in the last month, and it's the second best performing. It has quite a diverse matchup spread with not too many unfavourables right now actually. Snorlax being a bit of a problem, as well as Lost Zone Box Pikachu being an issue. But you have a pretty even time into some of the top decks we've already talked about, Charizard and Regidrago, as well as being reasonable into Lugia and Turbo Roaring Moon. And you're starting to have a good time when you see the Gholdengos, Terapagos Clorf, Raging Bolt, and also some of the newcomers in Archaludon and Dragapult Iron Thorns seem to not enjoy Gardevoir too much. We're going to have a look at Kato's first place list from the Perth Regional Championships. We've known Kato for being a master of Gardevoir for a number of tournaments now, remember back to the NAIC for example. The only real surprise is seeing 0 copies of Nest Ball and the elevated count of 3 Ultra Ball in the list. That could be an easy flip-flop, but otherwise I absolutely adore the 60. Tatsugiri is also a card we don't see too often, especially in the West, but this could easily be substituted for Radiant Greninja if you prefer that. Having both Klefki and Fluttermane for some early game ability lock is also a really great option in the 60. There are a number of archetypes right now which are very, very reliant on early game basic draw engines, making Gardevoir punish a lot of these decks that choose to go second by simply retreating into a Klefki on the first turn going first. Of course, Gardevoir itself will be opting to go second because we are looking for that TM evolution to get immediately into our Curlia and get our draw engine online before working towards our Psychic Embrace. Like I said, Tatsugiri is sometimes interchangeable with Radiant Greninja, so keep that in mind, whichever engine you prefer. But there's also a couple other tech-basic Pokemon like Spiritomb, which can disrupt some V Pokemon, like Rotom V, seeing as Snorlax is one of your more awkward matchups, but also can help out against the likes of Charizard as well. And then there's Morwar, which a number of players chose to bring to Toronto, giving yourself an alternate win condition with that tempting trap attack. If you scouted your opponent's resources, you think they're out, you can simply stick them with a continuous tempting trap play. The other thing to consider is having 2 dimensions to Gardevoir, where you can have that slower approach with TM Evolution, but then you also have Secret Box and Rare Candy in your 60 to go aggressive turn 2 in situations where you've gone first. Not many opponents will prepare themselves for a turn 2 attack from a Gardevoir, so having this dimension in your deck list can completely throw off opponents. Especially because with perfect hands, Gardevoir can be swinging that 220 with the help with an Adrenabrain from Monkey Dory. Secret Box is kind of the card that stitches it all together, giving you extra discard synergy in the deck to get rid of lots of energy, but also helps you accumulate a bunch of things to continue with your turn. In at the 6th best performing deck, we have Terapagos Clorf, a deck that I'm affectionately calling Seafood Poisoning. It's the 6th most popular online and the 7th best performing, and it has a really wide matchup spread actually. You're best into Regidrago, which is a good boast, as well as Gholdengo, and happy enough to see the Lost Zone box builds as well as Raging Bolt. You're pretty even into Zard, Turbo Roaring Moon, and Dragapult Iron Thorns, and don't love coming against Lugia. Some of your worst matchups including Archaludon, Gardevoir, and Snorlax. For the deck list, I'm taking a look at Robin's Stuttgart 60, that got 7th place, and a number of pilots have taken on the exact same list to other strong placements. This looks like a crazy amalgamation of Pokemon, but draw your eye to the A-Spec, that precious trolley, which can get lots of these into play all in one go. And of course, Terapagos allows us to have that Area 0 underdepths, so we are going to go to a full 8 bench in a lot of situations. Clorf is the attacker that we can use on turn 1 going second, giving us a lot of pressure in the archetype. With Binding Mochi, with Brute Bonnet, plus Ancient Booster, and with Radiant Sneasler, we could be initiating a prize race on a bunch of basic EXs and V Pokemon. As we work towards the mid-game, Terapagos itself can be a great attacker, and we also have that Blood Moon Ursaluna EX, which can be a phenomenal finisher in the deck as well. Although the list does look pretty chaotic, you have that Latias EX to move around all these basic Pokemon pretty freely. And again, the Area Zero Underdepth is kind of the main fix here, allowing us to cash in on all these abilities. And then as the opponent removes our stadium cards, we can filter these to the discard pile and use Night Stretcher to reuse the likes of Luminion towards the latter stages of games. If you want to play around with a few additional engine Pokemon, you can think about a couple of Dragon types. Tatsugiri can help you dig for certain supporter cards, most notably Boss's Orders is one of the big ones, and Regidrago has that Dragon's Horde, which can allow you to draw up to 4 cards before then drawing with Pheasantipity EX, giving you a lot more security towards the late game when you are getting hit with Iono, because typically this deck is very reliant on that Fez. So against a handful of archetypes that can have a Countercatcher plus Iono play, or Boss plus Reset Stamp, losing that Pheasantipity all in the same turn can leave you with basically nothing. Both these dragons give you a way back into those games, even from low hand sizes. The Lost Vacuum is really versatile in the deck. It helps out against Gardevoir. It can give you great defense to Kyurem or Dragapult EX lines from Regidrago players. It can be annoying in the mirror match. It can get rid of hit point buff tools. Lost Vacuum is actually a card that I would really advise putting into the list. In at number 7 then we have Lugia. It's only the 10th most popular online, but it is the 6th best performing, so it is still proving itself to be a top tier contender. It has the rare boast of being strong into Snorlax, and is also decent into the Turbo Roaring Moon thanks to your Mist energies. You're happy enough to see Charizard, Gholdengo, Clorf, and Regidrago. You're pretty close into Guardi and Lost Zone box. You don't enjoy walking up to the Iron Thorns Dragapult for obvious reasons, and Raging Bolt is also a bit of a headache. And the new Archaludon is also a bit of a pain. We're going to look at Kieran Farrer's 9th place list from Toronto Regionals. Kieran's been piloting Lugia for a number of tournaments now to plenty of high placements, so he's certainly an expert in the list. And I'd really enjoy the 60 that he's come to here. Having Nestball plus Squawkabilly gives you good early game dig when need be. You've got that 16 energy to try and see you through with Chinchino and Weirded, the sort of energy hungry attackers. And for legacy energy users, you have both Wellspring, Ogerpon, and Iron Thorns EX, which can sculpt multi-prize KOs even on single prize board states. There are a handful of other attackers you could think about in Lugia. The Iron Bundle and Fluttermane both can give you outs to Iron Thorns, the Flutter being the more secure option, whereas Bundle is more useful in a ton of other situations, especially when you play Nestball in the list anyway. It's just extra ways of pushing things out the active. You got the Raikou V as an additional lightning style attacker if you want to. If you are adding this into the 60, you often go for Earthen Vessel plus 1 lightning basic energy in the list, in place of some or all of the Chinchino line. Some pilots of Lugia go for the Jamming Tower in the 60 to remove those hit point buffs, and also sometimes disrupt the likes of Forest Seal Stone and TM Evolution. And I know there are a number of players who like to go down a heavy Great Ball route plus having Carmine, rather than having Nestball and Squawkabilly. Great Ball giving you better access to exactly the Archeops, of course, and Carmine still being a Luminion searchable means of getting a dump and draw on the first turn of the game. And at number 8 then we have Gholdengo. This is the 8th most popular online, but only the 11th best performing. Gholdengo actually has a number of very unfavourable matchups, which are a little bit ugly for the archetype. You don't enjoy Snorlax, Lost Zone Box, Clorf Terapagos, Gardevoir, or Dragapult Iron Thorns, and you're also a little bit uncomfortable against Lugia. Things start to look up when you're seeing the Charizards, Raging Bolts, Regidrago, Turbo Roaring Moon, and you also farm the up-and-coming Archaludon archetype. We're taking a look at Owen's 6th place list from the Stuttgart Regional Championships, a list that I really enjoy actually. I'm personally a big fan of the Palkia package making its way back into the 60. Even with that Energy Search Pro A-Spec, just having 3 water suffices quite nicely to get a Moonlight Shuriken playoff. And Cancelling Clone is just a nice item to have in the deck regardless, that can see you through against some awkward matchups, but of course has the combo potential with Radiant Greninja that we've tried to use over and over again in a ton of different archetypes. There are alternatives though. Many pilots choose to have a Togekiss package within their 60 rather than the Palkia. Funnily enough, Togepi can heal 10 damage, which can be a big math fixer against Dragapult players and Regidrago players copying that Dragapult attack to offset the 260 hit points from a Gholdengo to take 4 prizes on 2 Gholdengo over 2 attacks. However, that's just a footnote because the main part of Togekiss is its ability, where once you take KOs, you can flip a coin. If heads, you take an additional prize card. Gholdengo is very good at making sure it can reach KOs no matter what's in front of it, so getting as many prizes for your KOs as possible is a pretty solid idea. There are a couple other supporters I would consider in the deck list. Roxanne can leave you with large hand sizes and can be great to coin bonus after in order to sit on a fantastic hand while still disrupting the opponent. And Professor Churro Scenario is another way that you can add some healing into the mix against some of these archetypes that are going to try and set up multiple KOs all in a turn. In at number 9 then we have Box. It's far less popular in the online spaces actually. It's the 15th most popular and only the 13th best performing. Once again, it has a pretty wide matchup spread, some of its worst matchups being Snorlax, Regidrago, which is a concern, and Terapagos. You're pretty even into Charizard, Lugia, and Archaludon, whereas you're quite happy to see Gardevoir, Raging Bolt, Turbo Roaring Moon, Gholdengo, and Thorns. We're looking at Liliana's 26th place list from Stuttgart. It's another 60 that I really like actually, no nonsense, leaning very much into the Pokestop engine, has the right supporters that you need in the 60 to have Hand Disruption and Gust, alongside your Prime Catcher of course, and just sticking to those high switching counts, Ball Search, and having those gates and rods to make sure that you're cashing in on these items when you can. Like I said, I enjoyed the consistency of that 60, so I wouldn't make too many changes, but Pheasantipity EX can be another great way for you to just see additional cards throughout the game. Especially when you're attaching your energies to the likes of Iron Hands, the opponent essentially has to go through it, so having a bench Pheasantipity EX can be a way for you to bounce back with even more gates and rods. And Spiritomb gives you a different option with Buddy Poffin. It means it can be disruptive against Rotom V, very strong into the Snorlax matchup, which is otherwise quite awkward, and is good into that Charizard matchup as well. If there's one item I want to squeeze into the deck list, it would be Pokegear, even as like a 1 or 2 count, giving you just more dig towards Colress, which as we know is still the bread and butter of this archetype to get it rolling with the Lost Zone count. For the 10th best performing deck then, we actually have Turbo Roaring Moon. It's the 9th most popular online and the 9th best performing. Once again, its matchup spread is pretty wide. It's decent into Thorns, Snorlax, Raging Bolt, and Regidrago VSTAR. It's performing reasonably into Archaludon, Gardevoir, and Terapagos, with a lower win rate into Charizard, Gholdengo, Lost Zone Box, as well as Lugia being its hardest. We're looking at Andre's 2nd place Bogota 60, and this list is choosing to incorporate Secret Box, which is surprising. In this case, having access to that Ancient booster is another way that you can have a decent time into Terapagos by pushing your Roaring Moon out of range, but also it does give you a lot more license to Frenzied Gouge and not get punished by the likes of Dragapult Sprinkle, and stay out of range of a number of single prize Pokemon that can just prod you, or get out of some sniping range as well. Even though there's Petrarch, this list is also choosing to have the Latias EX in the list, and overall saves a lot of space by having no switching cards whatsoever, and instead just relies on its abilities. Iron Bundle's always worth considering in an all-basic attacking deck, especially when you're going for Pokemon catchers already in the 60. Just having those guaranteed means of pushing are always welcome. It's quite frequent that you see Trekking Shoes actually in quite high counts in the Roaring Moon list, so if you are suffering with consistency, you can work in some more Trekking Shoe. Enhanced Hammer is trying to patch up your otherwise most awkward matchup in Lugia. And like I said, there is debate right now over the Ace spec. If you want to have those Ancient boosters, the Secret Box does make sense, but if you're willing to cut those cards, you can go for Unfair Stamp, giving you more means of surprise disrupting an opponent, or that Prime Catcher to have those guaranteed gusting plays to make sure you're always taking 2 prizes in every attack. You may have noticed I've been doing matchup data for 12 decks, not just the top 10, because there are a couple of really popular archetypes in the online scene, despite having not much success in IRL play. So we are also going to take a look at Archaludon, which is becoming very popular online actually, the 5th most popular in the last month, and the 4th best performing. And it's actually pretty obvious to see why. Its matchup spread is really appealing. It's having a good time into Snorlax, Regidrago, Lugia, Terapagos, and Raging Bolt, with a solid time into Thorns, Lost Box, and Turbo Roaring Moon, only really struggling against Gardevoir, Charizard, and Gholdengo. I think the main reason people are using the Archaludon as of late is thanks to Yota's 1st place list at the Osaka Champions League. Even though this was a completely different format where they have essentially prismatic evolutions already legal, the list Yota took actually played no new cards, so you can go 1-to-1 with his previous list. And when a deck wins a 5,000 player tournament, it's worthwhile taking note. For me, the main standout, or the wiggle room in the 60, is those Jamming Tower. I think they're much stronger cards in Prismatic Evolution's meta, because Jamming Tower is very effective at blocking TM Evolution from Dragapult and Gardevoir, which are both far more popular decks in the next format. Instead, we can try and have a consistency boost, adding Pokestop to the 60, giving us more means of discarding Metal Energy, and just sort of cycling towards our early game Ball Search. We're already very high on those Night Stretcher, so Pokestop feels like it has very few drawbacks. Similarly, Trekking Shoes could make its way into the list to give you extra dig on those opening stages. Alternatively, you could look towards having Artisan. Getting those Duraludon down is still really important to ensure you can get that burst acceleration. And even though you don't need Artisan in the deck for this card to be good, Iron Bundle again should be a pretty solid consideration. Finally, I would definitely consider a Lost Vacuum. Again, notably Gardevoir is one of your more awkward matchups, and whenever that's the case, a Vacuum can help out. But also it can be good for removing some hit point buffing tools. And if you want to try out the 1-1 Starmie package, players have used this to try and fix the math on Archaludon itself. That 220 being pushed into KOs for those 230 and 40 hit point basic Pokemon can turn the tide on otherwise awkward matchups. And then we have the other popular deck online right now, which is Dragapult Iron Thorns. It's the 4th most popular last month and the 5th best performing. This one feels like it has a slightly worse matchup spread than Archaludon, and I personally think it's a weaker deck. But at the very least, it boasts a decent time into Gholdengo, Charizard, and Lugia. It's okay into Archaludon and Terapagos Clorf, with some scarier matchups being Gardevoir, Regidrago, Snorlax, Raging Bolt, Lost Box, and Roaring Moon. The list that I really enjoy is actually Mads Jensen's. This got a 5th place finish at Stuttgart. Clearly a pioneer of this archetype, although it was quite popular out in Japan as soon as Precious Trolley released. And unlike all the other decks today where I've suggested other cards, I wouldn't change a single card from the 60. It's the only list I've been rocking, and I've never thought about adding an extra card in the list either. It does feel like Mad's got a good balance of consistency in the list, but has those one-offs that you can cherry pick with Arven to add some disruption when required. And even that Toedscruel, which definitely sticks out like a sore thumb, does seem to cover enough decks in the format to be worth the 2 slots in the list right now. Even though I've gone over 12 decks already, we're not done yet because the format is very, very diverse. There's actually a whole chunk of other archetypes which have got a decent amount of points in this format. The old build of Terapagos, the Dusknoir Checkmate list with Pidgeot, still is worth considering. Ancient Box, a more single prize approach, is still in the mix. Pidgeot Control, we know there are some players who are dedicated to this approach and it still can be successful. An Area Zero build of Miraidon has already won a tournament in this format, but hasn't done much since. There's the disruptive Iron Thorns list, which of course has won the World Championship, so it does have good pedigree behind it. Gouging Fire is yet another aggressive 2-prize archetype you could look towards. And then there's different options with Palkia VSTAR, there's Noctowl, which has done well and had top 8 placements, as well as Dusknoir, which has cooled off a little bit as of late, but again, we know what this archetype is capable of. Hope you enjoyed today's top 10, plus the other archetypes that I discussed briefly. Let me know what decks you're enjoying the most from Surging Sparks. Are Archaludon or Dragapult Iron Thorns going to make a splash in the upcoming tournaments? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.